Hello everyone, my name is Emma Ward. I am a disabled Irish traveller activist with a really passionate focus on disability rights. Another kind of fact about me is I'm a journalist and a content creator who's trying to change the perception of both the Irish traveller community and the disabled people community in Irish media. I am very, very honoured to be here today to chair this panel. I was just saying to Aoife, these type of things are my favourite things to do because we all share a very similar interest in disability rights, and I just love learning from all of you. So thank you very much. Our first panel speaker today is Aoife. Aoife is a PhD candidate at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, and her PhD is focused on disabled women's participation in social movements. She is currently working as a research associate at the University of Galway and as a part-time lecturer at the University College Cork. She has previously worked with the European Disability Forum, the Union of Students in Ireland, and the Centre for Effective Services. She is active within the disability community and is co-chair of the National Disabled Postgraduate Advisory Committee. She is an active member of Disabled Women Ireland and passionate about the intersection of disability and gender. Aoife was appointed to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission's Disability Advisory Committee in 2022, the organisation tasked with monitoring Ireland's implementation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There you go.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you for that introduction. I suppose firstly, I just want to say it's great to be here. It's actually my first summer school, and it's living up to all my expectations, brilliant speakers, participants, and conversations happening all week. And as a disabled feminist, it is really a joy to be here, especially for this particular summer school. So as Emma said, I'm a PhD candidate at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy here in Galway, and my presentation mainly focuses on this. And just for a little bit of context, I interviewed 53 disabled women from 23 European countries as part of this research. And I'm coming to the end of my PhD now after 5 years. And I'm both happy and sad about this because it had become a huge part of my life. I have really developed a wonderful network of colleagues throughout Europe and the globe. And I hope to maintain these relationships beyond the PhD as well. So much of my thesis focuses on disabled women organising in separate spaces outside of the disability and the women's movement. And globally, there are a growing number of country-based organisations focusing on the rights of disabled women that are led by disabled women themselves. However, many are working within a context of disabled people's organisations being underfunded already. And the issue of funding is even more pressing when it comes to these organisations at the intersection of disability. And I suppose really as well, the historic siloisation or siloing of gender and disability by grant makers often poses a barrier to securing funding to work at this intersection. And in addition to this, many non-disabled funders are unaware of the cost of disability and accessibility needs. And additionally, these organisations have also faced pushback from the existing movements I'm talking about in the focus of this study, the disability and women's movement. And just, I suppose, the reason I chose to focus kind of more on this is because many of those I interviewed were from these organisations, having been once involved or currently involved. And they were clear on the pressing need for them. The idea of these organisations as being a bridge between two movements emerged from the findings. Additionally, as well as forming a bridge, these organisations created new spaces for discussions and really, I suppose, welcomed disabled women into feminist spaces where they may not have otherwise been invited. So I suppose just emphasizing that not only were they abridged, but they were also unique in creating the separate space and being invited to tables that they otherwise, if they were in the mainstream disability movement, may not have been. And the current need for these organisations is really multifaceted and essential in terms of progression of disabled women's issues and their concerns. Therefore, these organisations should not be seen as a betrayal of the disability or feminist movements, as could be read from some of the existing literature, but as an essential addition to the landscape. My presentation will focus on the importance of reciprocal relationships and how I believe that this is really central around coalition building. And relationships need to be reciprocal. And no matter how big or small, each one can contribute to the other. So drawing on this research, we are looking at two movements, the feminist and the disability movement, as well as the separate space of disabled feminist organising that happened globally. And although these separate spaces, maybe some define as a movement and others don't, but I suppose the possibility really of mutual gain through reciprocal relationship will only develop and grow over time as the relationship strengthens. So firstly, I want to look at the feminist movement and disabled feminist organisations and their relationship with each other and how they can potentially be reciprocal partners in a relationship. So looking specifically at the relationship of the feminist movement and the disabled feminist organising and reflecting on how each can provide and receive from each other, I'll specifically look at accessibility, inclusive campaigning, perceptions, communications and influence. So accessibility concerns are a significant issue for the feminist movement. Ensuring access is fully accessible, is fully addressed, is far more extensive and expensive than non-disabled people realise. One way the feminist movement can be inclusive of disabled women is by signing up to the Inclusive Generation Equality Collective Feminist Accessibility Protocol that was already spoken about here during the week, for example. And I suppose disabled feminists and their organisations can really support the feminist movement in efforts to transition to a universally accessible way by acting as consultants and as sounding boards as issues arise. This must be a clear commitment and go beyond lip service as concerns about this were raised within the findings. By investing and committing to accessibility, their campaigns will have a much greater reach that disabled people can engage and nets can be cast wider in terms of influence and impact. Working together on issues of accessibility benefits both disabled women and the feminist movement. So feminists can also work with disabled the feminist movement can also work with disabled feminists to ensure that their campaigns are in no way ableist or discriminatory against disabled people, which may occur unintentionally. And this can be done by meaningfully engaging disabled feminists in an accessible way. Additionally, the feminist movement could potentially support disabled feminist organisations financially via consultation contracts for this kind of work, both mutually benefiting from the relationship. Some of the participants in my study did speak about creating guidance for the feminist movement. However, it was unclear and unlikely that this was done in a paid capacity. And disabled feminists need to be really seen as an asset to the feminist movement and not simply as an add-on or just to be included on issues concerning disability. And even when they have consulted disabled feminists, it has often been too late. And this kind of this can actually impede a relationship and cause more harm than good when people are brought in consulted at too late a stage. And I suppose really reflecting as well on the research, disabled women have supported the feminist movement and their campaigns, as can be seen within my study. However, they have often not felt that this is not reciprocal. And in the recent care referendum debated in Ireland, the feminist movement further alienated disabled feminists and indeed carers in their advocating to remove sexist language from the Constitution to replace it with ableist language on care. If only they had listened and engaged with disabled people, we could have worked together to have care recognised in our Constitution in a way that was liberating for disabled women carers and women in general. However, they did not see the need or have the courage to engage with disabled feminists, which was very disappointing. This was a moment where trust could have been built, but it was a failed opportunity to have an open and honest dialogue on these vital issues. And I suppose the feminist movement really is perceived to be have more significant weight or influence than the disability movement, according to my findings of the research. And most participants agreed that due to their number, structures and strong social history, the feminist movement could really potentially leverage the disability could leverage the disability and feminist organisations by working intersectionality and making room for disabled women within these structures, such as providing opportunities to meet, speak, and form ideas. So positive relationships and communication between these movements would significantly enhance the feminist movement and disabled feminist organising. Both bring unique elements that, if utilised, would enhance the lives of disabled women, particularly given the sheer impact and influence of the feminist movement. Now I want to look at the disability movement and disabled feminist organising. And concerning the disability movement, supporting disabled feminists, organising and contributing to a reciprocal relationship. I'll do this through explaining about embracing intersectionality, gender-sensitive campaigning, and supporting disabled feminists and their organisations. So the disability movement is changing, and the movement of disabled women is sometimes perceived to be more receptive to intersectionality than the disability movement itself. Therefore, in supporting disabled feminists and their organising through shared resources and shared platforms, the disability movement could consult the disabled feminist organisations on their ways of working and utilising an intersectional approach. This, in turn, could seek to address intersectionality and widen its membership base, particularly among young people, as they need young people in the movement for its longevity and to simply survive and thrive. The disability movement, as it currently is, tends to work in a gender-neutral way, and this was a key finding of the study. And I said this is really isolating for disabled feminists who have contributions to add and perspectives that are currently unheard of. For example, you know, a lot of emphasis is on independent living in the disability movement, and rightly so. But what about disabled mothers and you know, bringing that side and that element into the independent living debate and campaigns? And I suppose disabled women's concerns are currently not prioritised or given weight within the movement and its agenda. And this is very much the views of my participants of my study. And I suppose the disability movement is losing feminists and people because they're not addressing the concerns of disabled women, particularly around gender and disability. And the lack of support for disabled feminist organisations is something that really came out as well within this research. And it goes back to the idea of the disability movement being somewhat fearful of intersectionality and how this is somehow deflecting from unity and will weaken the movement. But this is not the case. And as referred to in the importance of these organisations, they are forging relationships with movements that would not otherwise exist. Disabled feminist organisations would benefit significantly from the support, would benefit significantly with the support of the mainstream disability movement. In essence, it is about the disability movement working towards feminist principles and supporting disabled women to have their voices heard through the disability movement and supporting disabled feminist organisations in their separate space. And just briefly, I suppose as well, just looking at all three movements, or three kind of aspects, the feminist, the disability and disabled feminist organising, I think finally there are steps that all movements and organisations can take to ensure that they have robust and sustainable relationships. And this is really through open and honest dialogues and collaboration. And I suppose really the importance of shared spaces and spaces for reflection between the disability and feminist movement was really emphasised within the findings. Both sides are sometimes wary of the other or afraid to ask what they think might be inappropriate. However, this dialogue would really allow for a deeper understanding as emphasised by those interviewed, the importance really of this open dialogue and space for reflection was emphasised. This other idea came out about sharing events and learning from each other, and that this was really essential in element collaborations. Participants spoke about how the movements often fight for the same thing and would be stronger if they fought together. One participant spoke about a campaign in Malta where the women's and disability movement came together as it was an issue that affected both movements. And things progressed much quicker because women were pushing for it as well as the disability. Additionally, in terms of accessibility, the feminist movement has a lot to learn from the disability movement. And one opportunity for this is through shared events. By working together, both movements will become accessible to disabled women. There must be strong relationships on all sides in order to progress things for disabled women and ensure their voices are heard, amplified, and have impact. Open and honest dialogue cannot be underestimated and is essential to strengthening alliances and collaborations going forward. Just on time, how am I? Okay, before, excuse me. Before concluding, I would like to look at two aspects of coalition building relating to my research. And this is ideological differences and the importance of political intersectionality. And ideological differences and lack of overlap of membership can impede a coalition. However, this is not always the case, as amplified by the Generations Ahead project. Generations Ahead was a project born from the knowledge that new challenges cannot be challenged in old ways of thinking. And from 2008 to 2011, Generations Ahead was the only organisation in the US working with a diverse spectrum of social justice advocates on the social and ethical implications of genetic technologies. This included people from the reproductive rights advocates who were understandably focused on defending and affirming women's reproductive autonomy, disabled people who were concerned with discrimination against disabled people through the use of assistive reproductive technologies, LGBT plus communities who saw these technologies as offering opportunities for family formation, and organisations advancing the rights of women of colour who had concerns about the exploitation of women of colour as egg donors and surrogates. In essence, these movements, goals and tactics were really contradictory to each other and actually colliding. But generations ahead really demonstrated that campaigns could be better supported with multiple movements involved. And in order to build the cross-movement support, they first needed to build a network which comprised of leaders and organisations that really understood the complexity of these issues and the really, I suppose it was about advancing social justice agenda for more than one set of constituents' interests. Generations Ahead did this by reaching out and engaging with more than 200 organisations for reproductive health and justice, LGBTQI plus equality, racial justice, human rights, civil rights, and disability rights, among other social movements. They convened several cross-movement dialogues to unite groups at odds to discuss the issues rather than gloss over decisive disagreements. This created a culture where differences were openly, honestly, and constructively addressed using an intersectional analysis to surface how each community experiences issues differently and how these struggles are really interconnected. Furthermore, shared values, principles, and common agendas emerged from this perspective. So strategy, just finally, I'll briefly talk, just very brief. I know I'm out of time. So strategies to achieve, now I'm moving on to strategies to achieve political intersectionality include coalition building. And a coalition, I suppose, can bring together any combination of social movements and social organizations. But to achieve political intersectionality, social movements need to acknowledge structural intersectionality and ensure that the framing of these issues considers different communication styles, power differences, and unequal access to resources. So successful political intersectionality requires a politics based on dialogue and acknowledging social, economic, and political power differences. An intersectional perspective acknowledges the multiple axes of domination continually shape movement, and this appetite from all movements to bring together. So an intersectional perspective acknowledges that the multiple axes of dominance continually shape movement, and this applies to all movements that bring together activists from different genders, classes, and ethnicities. Groups and organizations aware of power differentials among activists can engage in strategies to give voice to groups who may risk exclusion. One of these strategies is altering speaking representation with different groups and constituencies. And an intersectional perspective should be more widely employed in social movement research, especially in a way of understanding obstacles and opportunities for creating and maintaining inclusive alliances. And although intersectionality is primarily identified within the feminist movement, the full potential of this concept must be appreciated by all social movements. Intersectionality is a central theme to my research, and being aware of the privilege and making space for those less privileged is key to intersectionality. If the movements want to be genuinely intersectional, they need to accept their current structures and ways of working to allow for participation of those less privileged. One practical way of doing this is actually through supporting disabled feminists and their organisations. And just finally, I want to have just a reflection before I finish. So only a minority of movements can alter the causes of grievances that they address. Usually, they act from a position of relative weakness and are often unable to do this alone. Particularly small intersectional organisations such as disabled feminist organisations. Therefore, big and small social movements must embrace intersectionality and support each other in their work. I will leave it there and thank you very much.
Very well done. Before I introduce the next person, I would just like to ask, could you help me with this to turn the brightness up? I apologise. My eyesight is not very good, so if you just turn the brightness up, I can read it then.
That's at the end. So we have a Q&A session at the very end.
Okay.
When everyone's finished, then I'll...
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Don't worry much about it now.
So the next speaker is David Lepofsky. David is a visiting research professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Ontario since July 2023 and a past visiting professor of disability rights and legal education at the Osgoode Hall Law School. And for over 3 decades, he was a member of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and he holds volunteer leadership roles in the disability community. He is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, and he is a member and past chair of the Toronto District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee. From 2018 to 2022, he served as a member of the Kindergarten Grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee, appointed by the Ontario government to recommend reforms to tear down barriers impeding students with disabilities. He is also a member of the Board of Ontario Parents of Visually Impaired Children, and his Twitter is David Lepofsky. I cannot wait to hear this.
Thank you. Good morning. What lessons might you be able to learn from us humble Canadians about gender, disability, and advocacy? What can you learn from what we've done well, and what can you learn from what we have screwed up? Here goes. First, I think that there's a common theme I'm hearing here, and I know it is a powerful theme in Canada. Most laws that are passed in my country, and I expect in yours, don't come from the grassroots. Most laws come from government bureaucrats and legal departments and political parties. Our matrix of disability rights laws came from us. Came from us getting together and fighting for them, typically not having a clue what we're doing, and typically facing battles that seemed insurmountable. Have we done well with those laws? Well, we're better than had we not won them, but we got a huge way to go. The Supreme Court of Canada said something really powerful about 3 decades ago, not in a disability rights case, not in a gender equality case, in a freedom of expression case that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're meeting about here, but it actually, what they said bears directly on us. They said that, interpreting our constitutional charter of rights, they said, where there's thought that there might be a clash of rights, there must be no hierarchy of rights. They must be treated on a footing of equality. Sounds great, they've quoted it often, but they rarely actually follow it. And often it becomes a mask for actually creating hierarchies of rights. Let me tell you a little bit, not about what our courts have done, but what our community advocates have done, which sometimes creates hierarchies of rights in which people with disabilities can be the losers. So 44 years ago, our then Prime Minister, a guy named Pierre Elliott Trudeau, father of our current Prime Minister named Justin Trudeau, proposed that Canada should get a new constitutional charter of rights. That was great. He proposed that it should include a guarantee of equality. That's great. But it included a finite list of what discrimination would be prohibited: race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, or sex. Guess who wasn't in there? People with disabilities. This led a number of us to organize using the antiquated tools of 1980 to advocate. I was one of them. And we won. We got disability added to the Charter of Rights before Parliament passed it. In fact, it's the only right they added. What's amazing is that most people with disabilities in my country don't know what I just told you. Most people who teach constitutional law don't know what I just told you. They see the word in there. They don't know, like, we had to fight for it, and we won it. If you want to learn about the fight, I've sent to the organizers a list of links of supportive materials. It hasn't been emailed out to you yet, but I'm going to remind them, please email it to you. Please don't use Discord, because for those of us who are blind, Discord is not accessible. So emailing everybody would be a better solution. But among them, I actually just wrote a memoir of the fight to get disability into the Charter of Rights. It's sort of offbeat in the way I tried to write it, but it's available for you for free. All you got to do before you get the link from the list that I'm hoping that the organizers will send out, just Google the title. The title is Swimming Up Niagara Falls, because that's kind of what it felt like. And by the way, Niagara Falls is just between Canada and the US, so it's a really Canadian title. So just Google Swimming Up Niagara Falls. You can download, you can read it. But the key point that matters for you, for us at this discussion, was the odd interplay between us advocating for disability rights and Canada's women's movement. The women's movement was had already succeeded. In the original text. It guaranteed the charter was going to guarantee sex equality. That wasn't a debate. But they were worried from American experience that our courts might not protect sex equality as vigorously as race equality, because that's exactly what the US Supreme Court had been doing for years. So their solution was to say, before our parliament, if you add other grounds, or whatever grounds you may add, like disability, just make sure sex equality gets the highest level of protection. Sex, religion, and racial equality should be the hardest for governments to justify. Now, they were doing this at a time when the idea of intersectionality, nobody even heard of it. It was decades before we would have that enter our intellectual bloodstreams. And they did it because they were women facing a political system that was overwhelmingly male, and the battle they wanted was to win gender equality. I get it. But the harm it was causing was potentially that we could end up with a Charter of Rights which guaranteed equality, but it actually gave more equality to some than others. And to me, equality for some means equality for none. Did we fight it out then? Actually, no, because we were too busy just trying to get in. Now, the good news is we won. Disability got added. Moreover, we were fortunate that Parliament did not accept the argument from the women's rights movement at the time that they should define equality in these multi-stages or multi-levels of protection where people with disabilities would end up less equal than others. And not just people with disabilities, but a number of equality-seeking groups would be disadvantaged. However, that's not the end of the story. At the time that they were fighting this battle, the US women's rights movement had been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment, an amendment to the US Constitution which would guarantee sex equality explicitly. And this inspired and influenced the Canadian women's rights movement, as well it should. Now, the ERA failed in the States, but they were trying to get something like that in the Constitution, and it became more important because through the long and tedious constitutional negotiations in Canada, which I discuss in my memoir, but I won't burden you with here, some provincial governments didn't want a charter of rights that the courts would empower courts to override legislatures. Some did. The compromise was to add a provision to our Constitution, which is controversial to this day, that said for some rights, the courts can invalidate legislation, but the legislature can then enact a clause overriding the courts. This is controversial, and during the debates last year in Israel over the proposal to do something similar, Canada kept coming up, and if I had hair, I would have torn it out over the way we were being included in the debate, let's just say. But in any event, in the face of that constitutional override, in the last days of our constitutional debate, the women's movement organized, frankly, very effectively, impressively, to get a new provision added to our Constitution, Section 28, which basically said, notwithstanding anything else in this Charter of Rights, meaning notwithstanding that legislative override, the Charter guarantees, the rights guaranteed in the Charter are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. What it was believed to do was to exempt sex equality claims from the legislative override. In other words, legislatures could override the guarantee of equality on any ground except sex, if they wanted to. And that's our law today. So we actually have a hierarchical guarantee of equality in our Constitution. One, sex equality, which has fuller protection, all other forms of equality, lesser protection. Has this mattered much? Actually, no, it hasn't made, I don't know that it's made a decisive difference in any case. But it does stand as a hierarchical vision of equality, and that seems to me to be a contradiction. Now, ultimately, and the women who were fighting for this were absolutely driven by good faith, concern, and the legal framework they're in. I'm not, I could debate them, but I'm not, looking pejoratively at them or whatever. But in any event, what's really interesting is the wording they came up with, they could not have known actually has other harmful consequences. The wording is, the Charter guarantees, notwithstanding anything else in this Charter, guarantees the rights in it equally to male and female persons. Well, that should immediately flag concerns for people who are non-binary. Now, back in 1980, we didn't talk about non-binary. They couldn't have foreseen that the wording they fought for could well have a detrimental effect to some sex, gender identity, or gender minorities, which were not politically organized in the same way back then, or much less were they thinking in those terms. Not a result I think they would ever have wanted. So the first area where I'd say to learn from us is don't replicate when we actually legislatively do something that creates a hierarchy of equality rights, and one in which people with disabilities might end up losing out. The second of the two lessons, the three lessons I want to offer you to learn from is, even when we claim that we're doing equality and claim that we're trying to wipe out hierarchies, watch out, because sometimes it doesn't work that way. We've had two important movements, ones which I profoundly support. In the 1980s and 90s, a movement for what we call employment equity. The Americans call it affirmative action. A leading, brilliant judge, now retired, Rosalie Abella, who actually wrote I'm much indebted, she's a friend, she wrote the foreword to my memoir. But she invented this concept of employment equity to proactively promote increased representation in the workplace for women, racialized persons, indigenous persons, and people with disabilities. Now, that's a great movement. I'm totally supportive of it. But early on, some of the organizations that were implementing it either only did gender equality or gender employment equity or gender and race employment equity. Now, I'm supportive of those. But what we learned was that when an employer only practices gender and race employment equity, there will be an increase in the representation of women without disabilities and racialized persons without disabilities, but there could well be a decrease in the representation of people with disabilities and indigenous people, what I would call accelerated employment inequity. Not what anybody wanted, but a collateral damage that we got to watch out for. More recently, in the US and Canada, and perhaps to some extent elsewhere, movements in organizations for equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. I've seen the letters organized DEI, IDE, like I get a headache. But I got a solution. Promoting the idea of no hierarchy, but in a number of our universities, school boards, governments, corporate settings, practiced operationally focused on race and indigeneity. Now, again, I support what they're trying to do. I support what they're doing. We need more, but too often not including people with disabilities. And so what they tend to do is promote equity and diversity and inclusion for racialized persons, indigenous people without disabilities, and not any of the rest of the equality-seeking community needed. Rather than eliminating a hierarchy, they'd simply create a new one, and guess who's at the bottom? There is a solution. I didn't invent it, I stole it. People have suggested, let's add the word accessibility and rearrange the letters. I-D-E-A. Inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. Sounds like a good idea to me. Get it? So this is and some places are doing it, and that's great. It's actually a really constructive way of rearranging things. Again, not my idea, heard it from others, appropriated it, and then confessed to plagiarism. We are in a university, I guess I gotta confess if I'm doing it. The third phase, overlapping, has been a drive towards intersectionality. And I'm seeing this more and more and more. I can tell you that when the proposed Accessible Canada Act was before Parliament in 2019, the Canada Disability Benefit Act was before Parliament last year, both acts which are well-intended but grossly inadequate. At least the government of the day was prepared to accept amendments demanded across the board from within the disability community that intersectionality be entrenched in them. I regret without much clarity of what actual practical effect it would have, but at least it's much more acknowledged now. Well, let me take my remaining time to shift gears and talk just about community organizing and advocacy. I would love to talk to you for a ton more time about this. I'm going to just tease you with a few lessons that you might want to draw on, and I'm here for lunch. And I'll be at the barbecue, and anybody online, we'll email you some of the barbecued food. But if you want to learn more, this is when I become like one of those on television, infomercials. I invite you to get updates from my coalition that I lead, updates that I write, and I'm going to make it easy for you to get them. If you're in the room, my dear friend and fellow troublemaker, Alon, is going to pass a pad around and a paper and a pen. Print your email address if you want to get our updates. If you need assistance, Alon, I am now hiring you. I'm volunteering you that you will help people write them down. If you're online and you want to get our updates, don't listen to me talk now, just do the following. Go to www.aodaalliance.org. There's a sign-up link, paste in your email, you'll get our propaganda, full of ideas. Here are just a few. Community organizing strategies. Number one, the old way of doing disability advocacy. It's good, you can keep doing it. I invite you to do it differently because I think the future is going to be very different from the past. The old way of, so here's some of the ideas. Number one, and when my time is up, just hit me, okay? Or hold up a sign, that's my trick. Okay. The first thing is, the old way of doing community organizing is form a cross-disability coalition, fundraise, and then get together and have a shared input process to decide on your priorities, blah, 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 right? No. I don't mind if you do it, but if you want to get action, my view is borrow from the idea of a business startup. Get a small group together, pick a single issue that you already agree on, and just go advocate. Yeah. Then the other folks will follow. If you're getting somewhere, if you've got a good case, then the cross-disability movements will join in. And by the way, if you're women with disabilities and you want to focus on gender-specific issues that we've talked about at this conference, go for it. It's totally suited for this. And the beauty of it is, you don't need to worry about solidarity and what if we all and blah, blah, blah. Just get 5 of you doing it and just go do it. Number 2, redefine the group. Redefine who our constituency is. I'm going to show you how I do it, okay? I get to an audience of any sort and I do the following, and people know I'm blind because I'm holding a white cane and I mention it. I go like this. I want to know if our issues affect you, so let's do a survey. It's completely unscientific, and therefore it's really good. I want you to raise your hand right now if you have no disability now and you are certain you'll never get one. Raise your hand. And then I turn my head from side to side and go, shucks, I don't see any hands. And then I say, welcome to the weirdest minority of all. We are the minority of everyone. So we've now defined the world in a way where there's only one side, us. The third strategy, and with great respect for people who've spoken about the importance of recognizing ableism, I get it. I understand the passion behind it. When I'm doing my advocacy, I actually don't talk about it. I want terminology that will do the following. I want terminology that will unite people with disabilities behind it, whatever be their disability, and that obligated organizations I want to change, will feel compelled by but not threatened by. And the magic word we've arrived at is barriers. So we've all used that in our panels. What's the beauty of barrier? Barrier is the mirror in which you will all see or experience whatever be your disability. I'm a blind guy. It's an app like Discord. It's not accessible. That's a barrier. If you're in a wheelchair and there's stairs, that's a barrier. But barrier is the thing that unites us all. And when you get in front of folks with any kind of disability, you say, hey, do you think we live in a world without barriers? Of course not.
Thank you so much, David.
All right.
I really enjoyed that.
All right. I'm going to wrap up in 2 sentences by saying, if we use the term barrier, the beauty of it is it unites us, and no business likes barriers. Gets in the way of business. So if we talk about barriers, the goal of a barrier-free society, it's an ambitious goal, but it's not a threatening goal. Anyway, I look forward to your questions. Those were 2. I got lots more tips. Take care. Thank you.
Very well done. So the next speaker is Siobhan Mullally. Siobhan is an established professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the University of Galway. In 2020, she was appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. From 2017 to 2019, Professor Mullally was the president of the Council of Europe Treaty Monitoring Body, the group of experts on action against trafficking, and previously served as first vice president from 2015 to 2017 and member. She was a commissioner with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and also a member of the joint treaty body of the Northern Irish Human Rights Commission and the Irish Human Rights Commission. She is a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, The Hague, and was the founding joint editor-in-chief of the Irish Yearbook of International Law, published by the Hart Bloomsbury in Oxford. So, yeah, that's the next one.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Siobhan Mullally. I'm speaking today in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on trafficking in persons, especially women and children. The presentation is jointly with Keelan Barry, who's joining us online. Keelan is an Irish Research Council PhD scholar at the Irish Centre for Human Rights and at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy here in Galway. We are also being joined by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Hiba Higras, who'll be joining via video recording virtually. So I am just going to introduce this work, which is really just starting, in that we are looking jointly at the intersections of trafficking in persons, human trafficking, and the rights of persons with disabilities. As very briefly to introduce my role as a UN Special Rapporteur, I'm part of the United Nations Special Procedures System. We're appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. We are independent, also independent of the UN, and we operate through a number of procedures that are available to us, which can be useful in terms of building solidarity, organising and advocacy. To mention, some of you may be familiar already with those, so I'll just mention very briefly. As UN Special Rapporteurs, we issue communications to states. So we receive submissions, information from individuals, from NGOs, from organisations, highlighting particular situations of individual or group-based rights violations. And we have to investigate those and verify those, and then issue communications to states, which can be in the form of an allegation letter, where there are specific, credible allegations. We set those out and ask a number of questions and ask for responses. The allegation letters are confidential for 60 days and then published, and they are published regardless of whether or not a state consents. We also issue what are called other letters, and these are comments on legislation or policy or action plans, and these are public after 48 hours. So it's a useful way to comment on pending legislation if there's a risk that it is likely to violate rights or is not achieving the highest standards. We also issue urgent appeals where there's a risk to life or deprivation of liberty, for example. Other kinds of tools available to us include interventions in courts, advocacy with international organisations and governments. We publish thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and we also issue country reports and conduct official country visits. And we issue statements, press releases, such as today on World Refugee Day, for example. So I just want to talk about why we have started this work jointly on the intersections of human trafficking and disability rights. First, it's when I took up my mandate for the first term in August 2020, and started to look at some work on this, I realized that there was a huge gap. So much of the commentary, the action plans, the legislation, the programming, the policy documents on trafficking in persons include no reference to disability or disability rights, or just a very brief reference, disability, along with a list of other potential intersecting factors that increase vulnerability to trafficking. So, and in meetings, in consultations, in meetings with anti-trafficking organisations, with regional bodies, there seemed to be a very significant gap here. We see this also in terms of the data on trafficking in persons available from countries or regions. It's not disaggregated with reference to disability. The only country that I'm aware of that has that systematic kind of disaggregation, but it's also limited, is Colombia. But otherwise, there's some ad hoc data, but not systematically gathered. So a huge gap in terms of information and monitoring. This we've discussed with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, and also with regional organisations who are beginning to work on the intersections of disability rights and trafficking in persons, particularly ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, pushed to work on this, in particular by Australia, who has a core kind of focus on this area of work. And more recently, the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has highlighted this as a thematic priority. We've also urged the UN Interagency Group on Trafficking in Persons to include disability and disability rights as a priority focus, recalling that this is a gap, and the Interagency Group brings together 31 organizations across different parts of the UN system. The UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Hiba Hegras, who we'll hear from shortly, has also decided to take this on as an area of work that we will look at jointly, and as a priority, hopefully also engaging with Conference of States parties to the CRPD. Very quickly, in case that there isn't familiarity with the legal definition of trafficking in persons, I just want to note that the accepted legal definition comes from the Palermo Protocol from 2000, which was a protocol to the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. That's the accepted legal definition that we see reproduced in legislation and in regional instruments. On the slide there, you see the core elements of the definition, which we see repeated with slight modifications, but these are the core elements. So first, it's action or act. Second, it's means. And third, it's purpose, purpose of exploitation. So by act, this includes recruitment, transfer, transport, harboring, or receipt. Any of those actions are an element of trafficking in persons. Means can include deception, coercion, fraud, or abuse of a position of vulnerability. And purpose, the purpose of exploitation can be sexual exploitation, forced labor, it can be exploitation in criminal activities, it can be illegal adoption, it could be child or forced marriage. The list, it's important to note that the list is not exhaustive. So it's at a minimum, these are purposes of exploitation. And it's important to note that with regard to children, defined in the protocol as anyone under the age of 18, it is not necessary to show means. So it's not necessary to show deception or fraud or coercion or use of force or abuse of a position of vulnerability. It's only necessary to show action and a purpose of exploitation. So that's really important, in particular because we often see that victims of trafficking, who may also be irregular migrants, for example, or who may be from a minoritized community or indigenous community, they're often not believed, particularly adolescents, teenagers. So it said, well, they knew what they were doing, they weren't deceived. It's not necessary to show deception or fraud with regard to a child. This is the accepted legal definition. And I just want to note that a lot of anti-trafficking action and programs and policies have focused on criminal justice responses, prosecution, and accountability, which is important, but the human rights element is often missing. Also, a lot of anti-trafficking action has focused on border controls, so preventing trafficking in persons by restricting migration, by stopping the boats, for example. We often hear this. Instead of recognizing that by expanding safe migration, access to refugee protection, that this can actually prevent trafficking in persons because it prevents dangerous journeys and risky situations. And the Palermo Protocol that was adopted in 2000, it's a protocol to the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So that's why partly you have this focus on criminal justice responses. And the main UN agency working on trafficking is UNODC, working on drugs and crime. So it's been difficult to bring the trafficking discussion over into the wider human rights system, including to the UN CRPD. But it's really important to note that the prohibition of trafficking in persons is part of a very old body of law, prohibition on slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour. And that's a norm of customary international law. It's a peremptory norm in international law. So it's a human rights obligation on states. So we really need to get it outside of the criminal justice focus and the border control focus, and we need all of the human rights instruments working together. With regard to the gaps, concerning the rights of persons with disabilities, what we need to recognise first is that disability may be acquired as a result of trafficking, so it may be a consequence of trafficking in persons. That can be psychosocial disabilities, could be physical disabilities, acquired because of the serious crime and serious human rights violation of trafficking. People with disabilities may be at greater risk of trafficking and exploitation in certain situations. For example, in a conflict situation, in a situation of dependency or institutionalization, because of gaps in rights protection. Where there is a failure to include disability rights in anti-trafficking measures or programs, that means that victims of trafficking with disabilities are not identified, are not given assistance and protection. The information available with regard to prevention is not accessible. And in situations of conflict or displacement or forced migration, as Keelan Barry has highlighted in particular in her work and submissions to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we know that there are increased risks of vulnerability and exploitation because of lack of planning, lack of accessible transport, lack of accessible information, and gaps that leave people with disabilities in situations of vulnerability, including then increasing risks of trafficking in persons. So this work is really intended, this joint work, which is just starting, is intended to try to recognise these intersections across what are called the 4 Ps of anti-trafficking action: prevention, protection, prosecution, which is about accountability, and participation, which is about ensuring that the actions are led and designed by people with disabilities who may be victims of trafficking or at risk of trafficking. In relation to the particular rights that are recognised in law of victims of trafficking, rights to identification, it's a positive obligation on the state to identify a victim of trafficking. It's not a requirement to self-identify, it's a legal obligation on the state to identify a victim of trafficking, including people who are at risk of trafficking, and to ensure assistance and protection. So that includes, of course, people with disabilities. The right to assistance, it should be unconditional assistance. So the assistance should not be conditional on cooperating with a criminal justice investigation, recognizing that a victim of trafficking may be severely traumatized, may be afraid of reprisals and violence from those involved in trafficking, and remembering that those involved in trafficking can be family members, community members, militia or armed groups, or criminal networks or gangs, or those working in institutions or government officials. The rights to assistance include legal assistance, psychosocial assistance, medical assistance, housing, access to employment and training. Really importantly, there is the right to non-punishment where an unlawful act may have occurred. For example, if a victim of trafficking is involved in drugs offences, in sale or supply or trafficking of drugs, or is an irregular migrant, they should not be punished for that unlawful act if it is a consequence of trafficking. And that's really important, where we see many victims of trafficking with disabilities prosecuted and punished, including in, for example, drugs offences or illegal crossings. So non-punishment is critical. And then access to remedies and accountability, access to justice. We must ensure rights of persons with disabilities in line with the CRPD, access to justice and procedural accommodations. So that's very briefly the key areas of work that we want to prioritise. And I'm going to now move to the video recording from the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Hiba Hegras. Thank you. So we can show the video recording now. Thank you. I think this is going to appear, hopefully. So Hiba Hegras is the new UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities appointed this year. It's just taking a minute, but hopefully it will appear.
Well, I was going to introduce it.
You're going to introduce Hiba?
Yeah.
Or, okay, I think.
No, it's fine.
And disability justice are relevant to questions on trafficking in persons in several ways. In addressing how trafficking in persons may impact upon persons with disability, it is essential to start from a human rights perspective. The CRPD provides us with the normative framework that can and must shape and define actions to combat trafficking in persons with disabilities and to ensure access to justice for victims of trafficking, especially Article 11, which states, state parties shall take, in accordance with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities. In situations of risks, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. Due to continuing discrimination, violence, and marginalization, people with disabilities may face greater risks of trafficking in situations of vulnerability and risk. A lack of access to just and fair conditions of work increases risks of trafficking. Situation of dependency and caregivers may increase vulnerability if there is a lack of regulation and oversight. Institutional settings may increase risks of trafficking, for example, for purposes of sexual exploitation due to failure of regulation and oversight. Persons with disabilities, particularly children, may also be targeted for trafficking in persons for specific purposes, such as exploitation in begging or criminal activities, or for sexual exploitation. Women and girls with disabilities may be at greater risks of trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation. But we must remember that men, boys, and persons of diverse gender identities are also targeted and may face additional obstacles in reporting and receiving assistance due to stigma and discrimination. This short statement addresses the 4 P's of law, policy, and practice on trafficking in persons from a disability rights perspective. First, prevention. Persons with disabilities are not involved in the design and implementation of anti-trafficking measures, and consequently, those measures are not effective. Currently, actions to combat trafficking in persons do not effectively address the particular risks that may be faced by persons with disabilities. Information, awareness raising campaigns, hotlines, and apps are not always accessible for persons with disabilities. Anti-trafficking action plans, programs, and policies do not take account of the rights of persons with disabilities or particular risks that may arise. A lack of training on trafficking risks for persons with disabilities or measures to ensure accessibility and accommodation in all anti-trafficking actions creates gaps in prevention and protection. Situations of risks and emergencies such as conflict, displacement, disasters, including climate-related disasters and displacement, all increases the risks of trafficking in persons. Too often, disaster response plans or evacuation plans in situations of conflicts are not accessible for persons with disabilities. There is a lack of access to accessible transportation or information, and a lack of training for humanitarian and protection actors. The harmful stereotype that persons with disabilities do not migrate or move internally or across borders lead to gaps in prevention and protection measures for displacement of persons with disabilities, including refugees. Migrants with disabilities may be at a greater risk of risky, dangerous journeys and lack of accessible services. Effective prevention requires more resettlement programs, relocation for persons displaced, and safe migration routes. Secondly, protection. Safe and accessible accommodation for survivors of trafficking with disabilities must be provided. It is essential to ensure that persons with disabilities can exercise legal capacity and that services for assisted decision-making are provided. Identification of victims of trafficking and persons at risk is a positive obligation on states and requires training to ensure that identification assistance measures respect and ensure the rights of persons with disabilities. Barriers to reporting, including discrimination, stigma, lack of accessibility, and risk of violence, including reprisal for families or community members who may be involved in trafficking of persons with disabilities. Positive action is needed to ensure effective protection. Assistance and protection must be unconditional, that is, not dependent on cooperation with police, and must be long-term and properly resourced. In situations of displacement, disasters, or conflict, all response measures must be fully accessible, recognizing particularly a risk faced by persons with disabilities. Thirdly, prosecution, access to justice and accountability. To ensure effective access to justice, procedural accommodation must be provided as required, and measures to ensure exercise of legal capacity is supported for victims/survivors of trafficking with disabilities. Compensation and remedies must recognize that particular harms and human rights violations endured and ensure guarantees of non-repetition. Finally, partnerships. Ensuring effective prevention, protection, and accountability measures requires inclusion of leadership, of persons with disabilities in the design of all anti-trafficking measures and in their implementation. Urgent action is needed to strengthen partnerships with disability rights organizations to highlight the need for more effective action to prevent trafficking in persons and to ensure the rights of persons with disabilities. Children with disabilities, it is urgent that we take action to address the increased risk that children with disabilities may face due to discrimination, weak child protection systems, and violence. Prevention of trafficking of children with disabilities require us to fully implement the Convention on the Rights of Children and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, especially Article 7 in the CRPD. From a disability rights perspective, children in institutionalized settings may be at a greater risk where there is a lack of regulation and oversight. As such, ending the institutionalization of children with disabilities and all persons with disabilities and supporting independent living will also strengthen the prevention of trafficking of persons with disabilities and their effective protection measures.
So now I'm going to introduce Keelan Barry. Keelan is a PhD researcher based at the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the University of Galway. Since 2020, Keelan has written and worked with Professor Siobhan Mullally, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. The aim of this work has been to increase visibility and awareness to international law, policy and practice of the intersections of disability and heightened risks to trafficking in persons faced by persons with disabilities. Keelan's other research and writing has included a focus on the reception conditions of asylum seekers with disabilities in the Irish International Protection System, Disability and Asylum Law, as well as multiple submissions to the UN treaty bodies on disability human rights. Keelan has a particular interest in the human rights protection of asylum seekers and refugees with disabilities, intersectional discrimination, as well as the rights of persons with disabilities in humanitarian crisis and conflict situations.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm quickly just going to make a few points because both special rapporteurs have covered the main point that this is a hugely invisible issue, both within disability discourse, within asylum, really of I would say migration and disability. There are grey areas here that really trafficking is very invisible as a topic, and within all of our legislation and policies, again, as discussed previously, disabled people who are at increased risk of trafficking within the UN system, within all international protection type systems. There has been very much a lack of any focus on this until Siobhan has raised it as part of her mandate. Starting in 2020, and huge progress has been made in such a short time. It was great to see Hiba's presentation. She's hugely passionate as well, and I just want to acknowledge both Special Rapporteur Hiba Hagras and Siobhan Mullally on the amount of work you've put in such a short period to raise this issue globally. So what I'll quickly talk about some increased vulnerabilities persons with disabilities may face. So some certain types of disabilities, including some people with intellectual disabilities or other types of disabilities may not have perceptions of safety and risk, and may be at increased vulnerability around criminal people and gangs. And also, it isn't always a criminal aspect as discussed. It can be a person who has a disability, who has not been displaced and is in their community and is being targeted due to their disability for of either sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, forced begging, forced criminality, fraud, stealing of welfare, and theft of government benefits. So within trafficking overall, persons with disabilities may have also additional barriers to accessing supports or legal supports due to stigma, due to family members being involved in their trafficking situations, or having communication and barriers, having been trafficked across borders with no supports in those places, and not being able to advocate for their own rights, or actually, and also consent issues are raised as well. The power imbalances, obviously, that would exist if you've been trafficked between yourself and the trafficker or group that is involved in the trafficking could be terrifying to people, hugely traumatic, and as Siobhan mentioned, may cause disabilities, but also may cause additional disabilities, so causing multiple disabilities with reduced access to supports, particularly if you are non-documented and if you are not aware of the systems or that the support systems that Hiba was discussing not being accessible, such as sometimes hotlines not being accessible for certain types of communication difficulties, language barriers, and also a fear of authority, as was discussed yesterday by Shruti in her presentation, of fear of police, fear of authorities. So disability discrimination comes into all of that as well. And then overall, looking at bigger issues such as employment, safe employment, forced labour, environmental risks and dangers to persons with disabilities, and overall core issues such as poverty and social exclusion. So the CRPD hasn't actually specifically mentioned the issue of trafficking as such, but there are references to obviously the rights of children and all the other articles that are relevant to protecting women, for example. So we can discuss that further. So I just want to end now because I know that the question time is coming and we had a really extensive presentation there. So I just want to thank Professor Siobhan Mullally, Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, and the Special Rapporteur on Disability, Special Rapporteur Hagras, for your great commitment in raising this issue. We're going to be hopefully coming back next year with a report that is going to be written that we're going to hopefully engage with some of your comments and questions now to include those in the report. Thank you very much.